Okay, today we're going to be going through notes number 4, the carbon dioxide oxygen cycle. We're going to be talking about 3 different processes in particular. Some of them you know already. Honestly, today is kind of like Friday's was with the photosynthesis notes, but it's a little bit of a review, but it is important to see how all of these fit together for plants. So we're talking about photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition. Before you get started, make sure you have either the handwritten note set up. Your title is going to be CO2 O2 cycle. Again, just make sure you remember that CO2 stands for carbon dioxide and O2 stands for oxygen. You have your notes number in the corner, it's going to be notes number 4, your name at the top. Then you should have your divider line with your topics on the left and details on the right. So the CO2-O2 cycle, I'm probably going to call it that from now on because carbon dioxide oxygen cycle is just kind of a mouthful. So what is it? It's important for us to remember that matter, all matter, which remember is anything that has mass and takes up space, moves in cycles through the environment, getting used over and over again. We mentioned this back when we did the water cycle, that the same kind of drops of water that are in our water bottles were on the earth millions and millions of years ago. They've just been recycled, evaporated, condensated, precipitated, and kind of go through the process all over again. So another example of matter that moves in cycles is carbon dioxide and oxygen, two important forms of matter that cycle through an ecosystem. The CO2-O2 cycle is the continual movement of carbon dioxide and oxygen between living things and the environment, happening all the time. So you can see 2 of the processes that I mentioned are over here in the picture. We have photosynthesis and respiration. And just as a brief review, photosynthesis is where the CO2 or the carbon dioxide goes into the plant cells. And they perform photosynthesis, the food is made, and then oxygen is released out not the top, but out of the stoma of the leaves there. And then the oxygen is used by living things for respiration, okay? Which in this picture we have an example of a human. It could be an animal, could be lots of things. But we use oxygen for respiration, which is where our cells take in the oxygen and convert that into energy for our bodies when combined with food and water as well. Bonus points if you remember, not really bonus points, but if you can tell me the name of the organelle that creates the energy for the cell. Hint, hint, it's the powerhouse of the cell. But anyways, the oxygen is taken in by the living thing, used for respiration, and then the CO2 or the carbon dioxide is released out as a waste product of that. And we've mentioned before that this is a really good relationship for plants and living things because this cycle goes on all the time, each of us using the other person's waste, which makes it very beneficial. If you're doing the handwritten notes, we have our first topic is the definition. We mentioned that matter moves in cycles, and then we wrote the CO2-O2 cycle is, and then down here is the technical definition. It's the exact same one as from the slideshow, and also would be on the notes, the printed notes. The next thing we're going to mention is the 3 different processes within this cycle: the photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition. First one, photosynthesis. Plants, algae, and sometimes some bacteria, depending on if they have chloroplasts or not, take in carbon dioxide from the environment and use it to make food through the process. Oxygen is then released back as a waste product of this process, and it is called photosynthesis. Really quick review of basically everything we discussed on Friday. Exact same diagram over here on the right. You can see the CO2 goes in. It is used to create the glucose, and then the oxygen is released through the stoma back out into the environment. Now, at this point of your notes, if you have the printed off notes, it does say draw a diagram of a plant taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. You can do that there. If you're doing the handwritten notes, you do need to include a diagram as well. So you can see I have that included down here. And printed people, you could include the same diagram. It really doesn't matter, but both people need to have them. So we wrote the first process, so I have a number 1 there, is photosynthesis. Here's the definition of what happens during that. And then my diagram down here, I have CO2 up in the top left with the arrow pointing to the flower or the plant, and then it releases the O2 or the oxygen back into the environment. All right, if that's the first process, then cellular respiration is the second. This is another process in the CO2-O2 cycle. Organisms, living things, combine oxygen from the air with food they've already eaten in a process called cellular respiration. We did mention this back in the cell unit as part of the metabolism of a cell. Has to do with how fast or slow the body can burn through calories and then use that to create ATP. All of that is done during cellular respiration. This word respiration may look familiar. It does come from the respiratory process, which is what we mentioned with our lungs and how all the organs involved in our breathing, which is the same thing. O2 is taken in, used for cellular respiration, and then CO2 is breathed back out. The carbon dioxide, or the CO2, is released back into the environment as a waste product of respiration. So it's really our respiratory system is the group of organs that perform this process, that take in the oxygen and release the carbon dioxide. Okay, now we're going to draw a diagram of an animal taking in the oxygen and releasing CO2. Here's my handwritten version. The second process up here, cellular respiration. These two have to do with defining what that process is. This is when organisms take in oxygen and combine it with food. Carbon dioxide is released back into the environment as a waste product. I guess we probably should include over here, they combine it with food to create energy. That would probably be a little more accurate. Look at that, cursive is easier than print. Okay, and then the CO2 is released back into the environment as a waste product. So this time we have oxygen coming into the organism. The organism this time is a cute little bunny instead of a plant. Do not judge my bunny. He has tried very hard to be cute. And then, not very hard, but somewhat hard. And then after the respiration process, the carbon dioxide is released as a waste product. All right, and then the last part of this cycle, the decomposition. This is another process in the CO2-O2 cycle. This is where decomposers such as fungi or sometimes even bacteria, they obtain their energy by breaking down the wastes or even the remains of other living things into smaller molecules. So instead of eating food and combining that with oxygen, their food, quote unquote, so to speak, is breaking down other organisms, either the remains of them or their wastes, etc. This picture over here does a really good job showing you all the different parts of the cycle. So I'm going to quickly go through that. This is the photosynthesis process up here, where the plants use carbon dioxide to make their food. We have the oxygen in the air. Over here with the cow is the respiration process. The description is actually here. Plants are eaten by the animals, carbon stored in the animal tissues, and then when they breathe out, the carbon dioxide is released back into the air. That's here. And then it goes back in to feed the plants. Okay. And then when either of these die, either animal waste, as in dead animals, or even dead plants that die, they are broken down by the decomposers, okay, which give off the CO2, which goes into the plant process again. So down here, the only thing this diagram is really missing is there should be a label down here for decomposition. Carbon dioxide is released back into the environment through this process, which is known as decomposition. Same thing I just explained. Okay, now you would draw a diagram of a decomposer releasing carbon dioxide back into the environment. So we'll go to the handwritten version here. Here's the third process, decomposition. This is where decomposers, fungi, and some bacteria get energy by breaking down remains or waste of other living things. And then once they're broken down, the CO2 is released by those decomposers back into the environment during this process. So In this case, this is not oxygen or CO2 going in. This is dead stuff or even just waste, remains or waste of other living things. Gets broken down by the decomposer, which in my picture is a worm. Cute little worm. He has a smiley face right here, but you can't really see. And then after that process, carbon dioxide or CO2 is released back into the environment. So underneath your last diagram, there should be a parentheses here. Underneath your last diagram picture, so underneath where you drew that worm or decomposer, taking in the dead stuff and releasing the CO2, I want you to write this. This is the main idea. If you have the printed notes, you don't actually have a spot to write this. You'll need to just kind of fill it in the white space underneath there somewhere. If you have the printed notes, you can, I'll show you in a minute what it will look like. But here's the main idea for today. There are 3 parts to the CO2-O2 cycle, and they are photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition. Okay, those are the 3 parts that when put together make up the CO2-O2 cycle. So, here's the main idea. I had to go on to the next page because I ran out of room, but the 3 parts of the CO2-O2 cycle are photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition. So your last job is to draw a diagram, basically putting all 3 of those parts together. So if you think about it, it's like taking the 3 things we just drew and drawing them, kind of putting them all together like puzzle pieces to make the full cycle picture. So I've included a video in the next slide of the pod, so you need to kind of exit out of this video, move on to the next slide, and that should have a video that will hopefully explain better how to combine these. But whether you're doing the written version or the printed version, you do need to have all 3 processes put together somewhere in there. So either way is fine.